This is the Fresh Start Project, where we explore the growing loss of trust in social institutions and how we can break free from broken systems and move forward towards something better. My guest today is Derek Maltz Sr. Derek served for 28 years in federal law enforcement and was director of the Special Operations Division of the Department of Justice's Drug Enforcement Administration. Derek, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Christian. I appreciate your time.
Absolutely. Now, you are one of the leading voices in this country who is sounding the alarm on the opioid crisis. And I appreciate that. If folks were to rely on most mainstream media or messaging from the White House, you think that the real dangers to America are anything but opioids, but you are saying otherwise. So I'm grateful for that.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm just trying to help the family spread the awareness and save lives. That's the bottom line.
Yeah. Let's start from the beginning, really. So, for anyone who isn't aware of the magnitude of the opioid crisis, can you describe the situation right now?
We went from a opioid addiction crisis where Big Pharma pushed out billions of pills into America, and 100 billion specifically, according to the Washington Post story, over a 9-year period. And so many Americans got addicted to legitimate painkillers, right? Like oxycodone, oxycontin, right? And so over time, the drug traffickers started to take advantage of the addicted population. So synthetic drugs became very popular in America. And that's really been a game changer. So right now, today, in 2023, we're dealing with a new problem, and that's synthetic drugs being made in dirty labs in China and Mexico that are coming into America and killing American citizens at record levels.
Yes. So this idea of the pharmaceutical companies pushing these drugs. I mean, I heard about this years ago. It was like high school athletes who broke a leg getting hooked, not hooked, but they were using these painkillers. And then after the prescription was over, then they wanted to keep feeding this addiction. That's how a lot of like small town or suburban folks started getting hooked. Is that right?
Yeah, that's accurate. So we had a lot of young kids that were getting sports injuries, car accidents, wisdom teeth extracted, and they started getting massive, prescriptions of legitimate opioids. And to be honest, like, thank God we had like legitimate opioids, because if you're in severe pain, this stuff really can help you out, make you feel better. But unfortunately, they were overprescribed. And my great example is that, a kid goes in for a root canal. Instead of giving the kid some, Advil or some type of, medicine over the counter, they're giving the kid 50 oxy pills, and the kid's taking these, feeling good, and then gets addicted, then can't find it and goes to the street and is buying drugs on the street, which are completely tainted now. And that's another big problem we have in America, is that the illicit drug supply is tainted all over the country. And that's why we're seeing so many people dying.
Now, the current crisis of illicit opioids, what demographic or region or part of the country is being hit most by this?
All right, so let me just go back and address the first question real quick, because I touched over it. So recently, President Biden basically said that international drug trafficking is a very extraordinary threat to our national security, okay?
Yeah.
And the reason this is being said now is because of all the deaths from the synthetic opioids, okay? Recently, even Secretary Mayorkas, Homeland Security Secretary, talked about how the record amounts of Americans that are dying from fentanyl is the single greatest challenge that this country faces. That came out of his mouth, exactly. And recently, there was also a press conference by the Deputy Attorney General, Lisa Monaco, who made it clear that the fentanyl crisis in America is the greatest public health, public safety, and national security crisis that we face, okay? So there's plenty of information that's been pushed out, but really what it comes down to is this crisis is impacting all Americans. It doesn't discriminate. It's not a red or a blue issue. It's a red, white, and blue issue. All Americans are impacted. It doesn't matter what socioeconomic class, what your status is, what your race is, what your color is. Doesn't matter if you're married or not, single. Your religion doesn't matter. It's killing people from all walks of life. I wish I can be 100% accurate in telling you which, demographic, for example, is impacted the most. The problem is our CDC does not keep timely and accurate statistics, which
Hmm.
is another problem we're having here with this. They're not telling the American public like what's really going on in a timely manner. So I will tell you that according to certain news stories, like NBC says that like Latino population has been increased their deaths from in 2020 by 30%. Okay, staggering rises.
Yeah.
There's other news organizations that have published, including NBC, that African Americans have been hit harder than any other, background. Okay, so people of all walks of life are being impacted. So it's kind of hard to say. And as far as what area of the country being impacted, all states in America are being impacted. The DEA administrator recently testified how basically they have found fentanyl in all the states in America. There's even information showing how the military troop deaths have doubled from 2017 to 2021. So basically, we're getting crushed. But probably one of the most disturbing, statistics that are coming out, Christian, is the Families Against Fentanyl, which is a nonprofit organization run by Jim Rao in Ohio. They have a bunch of analysts that are working to analyze CDC statistics, and they've determined that children are dying faster than any other age group from fentanyl. Of course, everyone knows they say the leading cause of death for Americans 18 to 45 is from synthetic opioids like fentanyl. But what people are not talking much about is that besides the fact that it's the leading cause of death in that age group, that children, specifically under 14, are dying faster than any other age group. In 2 years, right, as an example, children 1 to 4, the death rates have tripled. And then they quadrupled less than 1, and also the age group of 5 to 14. So we're seeing an explosion of deaths in these younger age groups, which is really alarming. And there's a lot of explanation for that.
That's all within the last couple of years, 2 years?
Yes.
Yeah. It seems to be a post-COVID pandemic situation.
Right.
Yeah.
That's part of the problem for sure. I mean, a lot of kids in America, they were in social isolation, they were depressed, a lot of anxiety, and it unfortunately turning to medication for help. And unfortunately, the medication that they're getting is tainted, and it's coming from these labs in Mexico or China, and it's killing them instantly in many cases.
Yeah. Just want to define some terms. So when we say the opioid crisis, it's primarily the opioid fentanyl. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. But you got to remember, it gets very blurred because for years, when we talked about the opioid crisis, we talked about legitimate pharmaceutical pills made by big pharma, legitimate prescriptions in most cases by
like
doctors.
Oxycontin,
the M30 pills and all these other, opioids. And that created this addiction crisis, okay? But now we're talking about the illicit opioid market, right? For example, fentanyl, right, is the one that we hear about every day in the news.
Yeah.
But there's also other synthetic opioid drugs like what we call new psychoactive substances, which is a class of drugs called nitazene, isonitazene, edonitazene. They are more powerful than fentanyl. They're also made in labs in China, as an example. And this is all emerging in the opioid crisis in America. So it's not just fentanyl. Fentanyl, of course, is the most prevalent. And then, of course, as part of this ongoing crisis, Christian, we have other drugs like xylazine, which is an animal tranquilizer, which is known as Trank on the streets. This is the drug that you're hearing about is causing skin ulcerations, amputations. It's causing like people to rot from inside out. They're buying that from Chinese labs as well. This is not an opioid, but it is considered a drug that's killing Americans at record levels because it's being mixed with fentanyl. So it's a deadly combination. We're seeing this all over the news.
Wow. Okay, so for the fentanyl or even just the synthetic opioids in general, these are made in a lab. they're made from chemicals? How exactly are these being made?
Well, what happens is obviously in China, for example, they have like over 160,000 chemical companies. So for years they've been making, drugs and legitimate drugs as well. I mean, the US relies on China for a lot of our antibiotics, for example.
Mm.
So they have all these chemical companies, and basically for many, many years they've been providing the chemicals, the precursor chemicals to the Mexican cartels to make methamphetamine. And now, over the last 10 years at least, they've been making this fentanyl, and of course providing the chemicals to Mexico, the cartels, to make their own fentanyl. I'm not a chemist, but there's several precursor chemicals that they make that are used in the production. And fentanyl is a powerful synthetic opioid, and the legitimate fentanyl is like 50 to 100 times more powerful than morphine, as an example, or 50
Mm.
times more powerful than heroin. But there's a big difference, Christian, from the illicit fentanyl market and the licit pharmaceutical fentanyl, which is still very important Schedule II controlled substance that is used in hospitals for pain and in doctors' offices to a degree. But that's for serious pain, and it's got to be under close supervision of a medical doctor. But what we're talking about today is the illicit fentanyl market that the Mexican cartels and the Chinese transnational criminals have taken advantage and have, dumped this stuff into America like a tsunami hitting the streets of America. So we're not really talking about the hospital grade fentanyl that's being used. That's not what we're seeing.
Right. Okay. Now I'm really interested in this China-Mexico cartel connection. So these are illegal Chinese organizations, or are these just unscrupulous pharmaceutical businesses based in China?
All of the above. So just to give you some background, only because it's very important, it's well underreported, but it's
Mm.
very important. I was the head of the Special Operations Division for the last 10 years of my career. And right around 2008, 2009, we started seeing, well, let me back up. In 2006, we saw the first significant fentanyl lab that was seized in Mexico that was killing Americans throughout the middle of our country. There were hundreds of people dying from fentanyl being produced in a lab in Toluca, Mexico. So the DEA in Chicago worked with the Mexican government. They shut down the lab. It was really our first sign of illicit fentanyl being produced by the cartels in Mexico. But then it kind of went away. And then in 2007, we had a huge money seizure in Mexico City from a Chinese chemical broker, $207 million in mostly $100 denominations. It was probably the biggest cash seizure in the history of drug enforcement in the world that
Mm.
I'm aware of. And it opened up everyone's eyes because it was all seized from one Chinese guy that was helping the cartels with methamphetamine precursors. And then what we saw was 2008, 2009, we started seeing very powerful synthetic cannabinoids and cathinones coming out of labs in China, being sent over from internet purchases into America. And that stuff is known as K2 spice and bath salts. So for many years in America, we had just an explosion of poison control centers being called, emergency room admissions. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of news reporting where we had hundreds of people in America just dropping on the streets in Washington, D.C., in Chicago, in Connecticut, in New York City, and no one really knew what the hell it was. It was from this synthetic marijuana, K2 spice. They were smoking it, and it was coming from labs in China. Well, we put a lot of pressure on these organizations, from Project Synergy, Project Logjam in my old operation. But then what really started to creep up was this fentanyl crisis. So around 2012, a lot of these same labs in China started sending Americans via, internet sales, fentanyl that was going directly to customers in America.
Mm.
And we started seeing massive increases in deaths that were at first attributed to heroin overdoses, because we had a lot of white heroin in America. The Mexican cartels were pushing white heroin all over the place. And we then got a lot of the information back from autopsies and realized it wasn't heroin, it was fentanyl. So in 2013, 14, we created an operation called Deadly Merchant to respond to this perfect storm of death and destruction in the country from fentanyl coming out of labs in China. So the DEA Customs and Border Protection, Homeland Security, other agencies started focusing in on these components coming out of China. FBI, all the agencies started looking at it, but it was so new. But what happened was the level of addiction was so high in America, more and more people started ordering this stuff from China, and they were mixing it here in America. But at the same time, they were building up these relationships with the Mexican cartels. So right around, let's say 2014, when the Sinaloa cartel and Cartel Jalisco New Generation started getting involved, they were sending primarily the pure fentanyl from China right to Mexico. But then over time, they started sending just the precursors, and the cartels were making their own fentanyl. And that's where we're at today. Most of the fentanyl that was seizing in America that's killing kids are coming right out of the labs in Mexico. But the precursors to make this stuff is still coming from China primarily. India, some other countries do send precursors, but the cartels have this robust relationship with the Chinese criminals that the business is booming right now. It's off the charts. The business is exploding.
Now the Chinese sales to the cartels of this the material needed to create the fentanyl in their labs in Mexico is that illegal there? Like does the Chinese government's law enforcement try to crack down on that?
That's a great question. Unfortunately, some of these precursors are not controlled in China.
Okay.
So it's not illegal to export some of these chemicals. Again, I'm not a chemical expert. I know there has been controls put on some of these precursor chemicals, but what I've been told across the board is that there's no enforcement. They're not really paying attention to it. So that's the problem.
Yeah, I mean the impression you sometimes hear from politicians who are talking about this is that it's somewhat done with the Chinese government's blessing or turning a blind eye to it because it's hurting us. Is
Right.
that
Well,
fair?
look, China is a communist country, as you know, and they have their unrestricted warfare, which is they're going to use every tool in the toolbox to destroy and destabilize their adversary. They're not going to put, soldiers in California or Washington, D.C. tomorrow. They're not going to bomb us. Hopefully they don't. But they can destroy this country sending poisonous drugs, whether directly or through Mexico. And that's what I believe is going on and has been going on for years. And now they see how easy it is and how successful it is. And that's why, as Mike McCall, Homeland Security, congressman, has said, that a great strategic plan for China is to sell fentanyl to America.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's move to the cartels. How are they getting this across the border and distributing it to all 50 states?
Well, number one, the cartels control Mexico. That's a given. The Mexican government is very soft on crime. There's systemic corruption all over Mexico, as we've seen recently with the conviction of Genaro Garcia Luna, who's the former FBI equivalent in Mexico, who was convicted on all counts in New York City, taking millions and millions of dollars of bribes from Chapo Guzman, Sinaloa cartel leader, and others. So there's been a long history of corruption in Mexico. So the cartels control the border. Not only are they controlling the flow of drugs into America, they control the flow of the migrants into America, and they control the flow of money and guns back into Mexico. And the reality is that if you speak to certain experts in the Homeland Security, apparatus, they say now they're making more money from the migrant smuggling because this wide open border that we have with this new administration's policies is creating such a money-making opportunity. So they're really operating with impunity right at our southern border. And they also have a pretty good operation on our northern border as well.
Really? Through Canada?
Yes.
Okay, that's news to me.
Yeah, I mean, look, forever the cartels have been providing drugs, mass amounts of drugs, to gangs and other organizations in Canada. Plus, we also know that there's a Chinese population that's up in Canada that's making fentanyl, making other types of drugs, using the couriers, using the people to bring stuff in from Canada. We also have a lot of people flying to Canada and then walking across the border now, because it's easier to just fly to Canada with their very liberal immigration policies, and then they just walk across the northern border. It's a lot easier. We don't have the staffing. CBP is so understaffed on the northern border. It's atrocious. And that's another widespread national security threat to our country.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay, so in my conversation with our mutual acquaintance, Dr. Shea Garrison Farrell, we were talking about border security, how it was a top priority for the Trump administration. Uh, the Biden administration has been very adamant about not enforcing border as much as Trump, or even much at all. So has there been an increase in cartel activity thanks to the Biden administration's policies?
100%. I mean, our poor Border Patrol, they can't possibly do their job. They can't do security because they're doing migrant processing and babysitting.
Mm-hmm.
They're American patriots out there on the border that will do anything to save lives. So if they see a couple of infants in the water, they're going to jump in and save the infant's life. They don't care if it's an illegal. They're going to do whatever it takes. And they're also going to treat people professionally. And they're going to, if people come in illegally, they have to process them. And this is all by design. They're flooding the zone. The cartels operate like a Fortune 500 company. They're in the business to make money. So they understand how the border operates. They use drones to actually watch our Border Patrol. And they use drones to actually do surveillance and to figure out our vulnerabilities, where they can best take advantage of their resources. So basically, our Border Patrol is being flooded with these illegals from over 160 countries. Then we got gotaways running across the damn border, these high-value targets. We have no idea who they are, where they are, who sent them, what they're going to do in our country. But we have over 1.2 million, since President Biden took office. And they're coming from Syria, China, Russia, Yemen, Iran. We don't know what's going on. We have such a threat in this country and no one even realizes it. No one's talking about it in the mainstream media. But when the big one hits one day, then people will want to know how that happened, because the border's wide open and this current administration has allowed it.
There could be hundreds of sleeper cells right now just kind of waiting.
100%, right. Yeah. It only took 19 hijackers to take down our World Trade Center and put us into a 20-year war, whatever it's been.
Yeah. Wow. Let's talk about the cartels. So you said that they operate like Fortune 500 companies, and the Mexican government has failed. Would you describe it as a failed narco state? Is that how bad it is?
100%. These cartels evolved from just being drug traffickers to transnational criminals, and now, in my opinion, the biggest narco-terrorist organization in the world. Remember, not too long ago, in my old operation, the DEA did a major initiative where we determined how closely aligned the Mexican cartels were working with Hezbollah, which is one of the biggest terrorist organizations in the world. Project Cassandra highlighted that to show the massive millions and millions of dollars of moving around the world, going back to Hezbollah to support Hezbollah in Iran based on drug proceeds that were, drugs being sold around the world. So this is nothing new. The cartels are going to take advantage of all vulnerabilities, and right now, it's kind of almost sad to even talk about what's going on now, because they're taking advantage of all the weaknesses with our current administration. When Trump was in office, we did have a secure border. It was the most secure border in many, many years. And you know what? Going back to the China situation, it was the Trump administration that put the pressure on China to control the fentanyl analogs, which caused China to stop sending mass amounts of fentanyl directly into the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
But, again, it didn't solve the problem, but at least the president before was putting pressure on China.
Right. So there are levers that the president can pull to kind of mitigate the situation.
Yes.
Yeah. The Chinese to cartel situation, I meant. Now, is this a global problem, or is America being specifically targeted?
Well, drug trafficking is a global problem, obviously. The Mexican cartels operate in many, many countries, depending on who you talk to, maybe 40, 50 countries. Mm-hmm. And, they're in the business to make money. So if they have a product, cocaine, meth, heroin, fentanyl, whatever it is. If they can sell it in a world market, they're going to do it. They have a very robust distribution network in America for all drugs, not just fentanyl. I mean, we're not seeing as much on the streets anymore, like heroin or even cocaine for that matter. But we do see lots of cocaine going to Europe. We do see, now we're starting to see shipments of fentanyl going to Australia, New Zealand. But primarily in regards to the synthetic opioid crisis, America's definitely getting hit the most. And it's my opinion, from all the years of watching this evolve, this is because China's behind it and they're trying to destroy our country. And they're doing a pretty good job.
Are there other crime syndicates in like Europe or Australia that are now being outcompeted by the Mexicans because they are getting the support from China? I'm just interested in the underworld.
Well, there's a lot of organized crime, like Albanian organized criminals are working very closely with Central America, South America, even Mexican organizations to bring in, cocaine as an example, all over Europe. Okay. And there are many organized, the Ndrangheta crime family in Italy. There's a lot of different organized crime networks around the world that work with the cartels. But in regards to the U.S., the Mexican cartels dominate all aspects of the drug crisis.
Let's talk about America's response to this. Like, how is law enforcement trying to contain the opioid crisis, both at the border, but also in hometowns and states across the country?
Well, look, law enforcement is out there every day, hitting them hard, getting the indictments, struggling with all the emerging technology, struggling with the lack of resources, struggling with the lack of support to law enforcement. I mean, look, it's not too long ago, right? The defund the police movement started, and the way then disrespecting police is disgusting in America. But in regards to the response, law enforcement agents and officers take the job to save lives, to create a safe America. That's what they do. And so if you look at some of the results, if you look at, for example, the first 6 months, the CBP has seized about 14,000 pounds of fentanyl at the different port of entries and, the border locations, okay? And then if you look at, like, DEA last year seized over 57 million fake pills, 13,000 pounds of fentanyl. You look at recently, they had the massive indictment announcement by the Department of Justice and the U.S. Attorney's offices throughout the country, specifically in New York, Chicago, and California, where they indicted 28 members of the Sinaloa cartel, to include all of Chapo Guzman's kids, the 4 sons that are running fentanyl operations now with other cartel members. But law enforcement's doing a very good job. They're saving lives every day. But unfortunately, this problem has grown so big and such a national security threat, the law enforcement solution alone is not good enough. And by the way, you got to remember, if they indict all these major players, they still rely on the Mexican government to apprehend and to, extradite these guys back to America, which is a big problem. It's a big gap in our process, okay? Because we're not getting the support from the Mexican government. So why do I bring that up? Because law enforcement, they can work very, very hard and not really see the results because they're not getting the cooperation, not only from prosecutions in Mexico, because the Mexican justice system is a disaster with a capital D. But in America, they can't get federal prosecutors to prosecute cases here.
Why is that?
Because many times they're lazy. They don't want to get their hands dirty in a drug case. They don't want to work 24/7, 365, which is required in a lot of these cases. This is not easy. Plus, you got to remember, we are losing big time in the technology world when it comes to encrypted communications, as an example. So the criminals are operating 1,000 miles an hour. Law enforcement is operating like turtles when it comes to chasing technology. So the gap between good and evil is growing every day. So we don't have our Congress supporting us in that regard. We don't have a lot of our prosecutors. They're political appointed prosecutors that are just looking for the headline story. They're not looking for, in many cases, they're not looking for, doing the dirty work in the drug case area. A lot of people don't even understand this is not a drug crisis. It's a mass poisoning against our citizens. So we have to wake the hell up. And there's no accountability. When they're appointed by the president, they don't care what Congress says. They don't care what, in many cases, what state and local people say. They care what the president says. And right now, our president is barely talking about fentanyl. So it's a total disaster, and all Americans should care because, again, it's not a red or blue issue. It's impacting everyone, and every family, every community is going to get hit in some way.
Mm-hmm. You say that it's going to take more than a law enforcement solution. Like
Absolutely.
what should we be doing?
Well, all right, let me just give you a quick, real quick snapshot of what we're talking about.
Yeah.
So in the middle of April, as an example, 12 poisonings in one day in Kalamazoo, Michigan, with 5 or 7 deaths. It's unclear how many died, okay? 5 poisoned in Boulder, Colorado around the same time period. In Milwaukee, in the first week, 18 dead. 18 dead. You don't even hear about it on the national news from poisonings linked to the bad batch of opioids. In the end of March, Onondaga County, I went to school up there in Syracuse. There were 40 drug poisonings, okay, in a 48-hour period. There was 5 workers at a mall in Hackensack, New Jersey that went out to snort some cocaine at a lunch break or whatever it was, and they all dropped. Thank God the first responders, showed up. Only 1 died, 4 were revived. But she was a single mother with a 9-year-old kid. My point is that the problem is massive everywhere in the country. Nobody's covering the comprehensive part of the story. Thank you for your interest in this particular story. But the thing is that it's just growing daily, and it's just getting so hard. So Congress is finally talking about using U.S. military action in Mexico. Congressman Waltz and Congressman Crenshaw, both decorated military officers, okay, who know how to fight the enemy, by the way, and understand how the Mexican cartels are an enemy of America right now, okay? So they both they introduced legislation, I don't know the status, to use military force to work with Mexico, to, just like we did in Colombia during Plan Colombia, and provide the technology needed to decimate their command and control structure and their poisonous labs. We want to destroy that stuff. That has to be done now. Let me give you an analogy. One of my friends, because I work with thousands of families around America, you can see behind me the collages that I've been making, trying to spread awareness with all these dead kids all over the place. But what I'll tell you is he came up with a great analogy. If you had a massive flood in your house from a broken pipe, okay, what's the first thing you got to do? Shut down the main valve. Then you go ahead and figure out why this happened and make the repairs. Well, right now, the main valve for our fentanyl poisoning crisis is in Mexico, in these labs with the cartels. We have to shut them down now, because every minute, every 5 minutes, whatever it is, depending on the stats that you read, because none of the stats are accurate, by the way, because no one's holding CDC accountable. So if one person's dying every 5 minutes, every day, do the math, right? How many people are dying every day we wait to act with a sense of urgency? This is not grandpa's opioid crisis, okay? This is the Communist Party of China working with the cartels, destroying historic amounts of kids in our future generation. That's not really that hard to understand. Let me tell you this, my friend. In the history of this country, Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, ISIS, all of these terror groups, they never killed this amount of Americans. And look at the billions and trillions we spent fighting them forever. But right now, we're still treating the cartels like they're our friends in Mexico. It's disgusting.
What would it take to decimate the cartels in Mexico?
In my opinion, based on my years of experience watching the greatest military in the world operate, is you get with the military, the intelligence community, law enforcement, intelligence, with the agents, and you work in a task force environment, and you start picking them apart. You identify the major players, you identify the major businesses, You identify the major cells in America, and you start a full court synchronized effort to destroy them. You use the latest and greatest technology. You use the best and brightest we have. You use the authorities that we have. You update some of the authorities that we need. You use the Treasury Department. But really what you have to do now, which is long overdue, educate the kids. I've been screaming from the rafters about this for years. So here's my solution for that right now, which no one's listening to. So this administration is using young social media influencers to help spread their public campaign messages, right? And for that, I give them a 10. That is super smart.
Yeah.
Because the young kids are not watching mainstream media. They're not watching cable news. They're not listening to this podcast. They're not listening to congressional testimony. They're watching video reels all day long on TikTok, Snapchat, Instagram. So these young kids the White House is using for the campaign messages is a brilliant strategy for them to get reelected. However, why can't they use those same young, smart kids to get messages out about how we have a crisis? If you take a pill that wasn't prescribed to you by your doctor, you most likely are going to die. Because DEA has said and has determined through their lab analysis that 6 out of 10 pills have a potentially lethal dose of fentanyl. So my point is, tell me one logical reason why you wouldn't have a summit at the White House and bring in professional sports teams, celebrities from Hollywood, role models, social media influencers, and have a summit, declare a national security public health emergency on synthetic drugs coming into America. This is why it's different. This is what we need. All hands on deck. Then you create a 45-second video reel. You pump it out. You get Tom Brady, LeBron James, J.J. Watt. You get all these rich and famous, celebrities, and you push this stuff out, and then the kids will wake up, and then they won't take this stuff. That's got to be done, and that's not being done. The kids don't even know what fentanyl is, and people are assuming they hear it in the news. They don't watch this news. Come on, wake up.
Yeah, I mean, the lack of interest until at least recently, to the White House's credit. But before these recent announcements, it's been mystifying how disinterested.
Christian, I've been talking about this over 5 years, like literally on national news, to Congress. I already testified a couple of times in Congress, most recently March 1st. It was so frustrating because I was at the same committee 2 years ago talking about a lot of the same stuff. And in 2 years, it's gotten progressively worse. And then many of the Democrats, they didn't even listen to what I had to say. They walked out. Many of them didn't show up because they're not interested. And no one's holding them accountable.
Oh, why is that, though?
Because, first of all, they don't care. They only care about themselves. They're self-centered, many of them. They really don't understand it. We had one congressman from Tennessee actually had the nerve on record to talk about the DEA and other agencies targeting Pablo Escobar. Pablo Escobar died 30 years ago. Okay? He didn't even understand the current situation because most of them have written off the drug crisis. Many of them want to legalize drugs. They don't understand. These are not drugs. These are poisonous substances coming in from our adversary in China and from Mexico. So it's a whole different world, but they're not taking the time to get educated, which is mind-boggling to me.
Okay, let's talk about how you mentioned a stat about how young children are dying much faster in recent years because of this problem. And I watched your appearance on Dr. Phil, and they talked about how fentanyl, that children are being able to access fentanyl on social media. The fentanyl is it looks like candy or sidewalk chalk, so children are getting exposed to it without knowing what it is and getting hooked that way. First of all, how are kids able to order it from social media?
Real simple. They go upstairs in the bedroom. They go on their Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook, whatever the hell it is. They just order it up. They interact with the networks. and drug dealers are dropping pills off at their house. I mean, let me show you an example here. I'll take it right off my wall. Alex Capilouto, senior from Arizona State University, lives in California. I'm going to read the note on the back of this thing that a father sent me when I was going down to the border. Basically says, Derek, please take Alex with you to Arizona. She should have been graduating from ASU this year. She was killed by a single counterfeit oxycodone pill. Thank you for everything you're doing. God bless Alex's dad. Now, she came home during Christmas break. She ordered a pill. I believe it was on Snapchat. It was definitely social media. Mm-hmm. The drug dealer came. They made the deal. They exchanged money, maybe through one of the banking apps. I don't remember the details.
Like Venmo or?
Yeah, maybe Venmo, Cash App, whatever it was. Yeah. The mother found her dead in the morning. She only took, I think, a half a pill. And that's happening all over the country. We have 13-year-olds. Same thing. So here's what I would say about that. The reason that more and more young kids are dying is because the cartels have invaded our homes using social media and the smartphone technology. So it's much easier to get your products to all Americans. And because the mental illness, the depression and anxiety is so high now with kids, that they're turning to pills to help them. And many times they see mommy and daddy are taking Xanax, or their friends are in college taking Adderall to help them in school. They don't realize that when they buy this stuff online, they're buying illicit fake pills that's going to kill them. And that's really the main message that has to get to these kids, because right now they just want some relief. Yeah. And my heart goes out to many of these families and these stories, because many of these kids are not like die-hard drug addicts. They're just kids like you and I were kids, and like my kids, that are living in a world that's very stressful, and they just, you know, they grew up in a world where pills were everywhere. Everyone was taking pills. So now they're just ordering them online. Mm-hmm. So that's a big problem. But right now, there's so many deaths from the use of social media that the families around America, they're suing. For example, there's an active lawsuit against Snapchat for facilitating the death against the kids. Yeah. And it's not just happening there. It's on Snapchat, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook Messenger. So the DEA had a press release in September of 2022, as part of their One Pill Can Kill awareness campaign. And there were 390 cases that they looked at during that time frame. 51 of the cases were linked to poisonings. 35 cases were linked directly to one of the two major cartels. But here's the big one. 129 of those investigations were linked directly to social media platforms like Snapchat, Facebook Messenger, Instagram, and TikTok. So this is becoming way more prevalent, but I don't want to mislead you. This is by no means the only way people are getting drugs, right? This is just another outlet. So these social media applications have enabled the cartels, giving them another avenue to distribute their poison. And yeah. It's just, it seems like it's getting worse because people are not getting the messages to the kids. That's probably the most frustrating thing. When I talk to a mother that just lost her kid, or a father, and they say, I wish somebody told me about fentanyl and these fake pills. No one even told us.
Yeah. So I understand China's desire to poison American children, but I would assume the cartels have some sort of profit motive to get them hooked and alive so that they can buy more. So if one pill can kill, why are the cartels trying to kill kids?
Great question. That's another question. It's like the most popular question I ever get asked. So you just got to think of it like this. The cartels are ruthless, greedy, nasty, and they don't care about human life. They throw people in acid to dissolve them, so you only find bones. They dismember people. They throw heads on dance floors at weddings. They cut people's arms off, stick them in their mouth with notes to intimidate their rivals and to dissuade, to pursue, just like all the informants, and identify the sources that are out there. So the cartels don't care about the customer. They care about maximizing their profits. And you got to realize a lot of people are taking pills every day and they're not dying because maybe they're getting revived by Narcan. Maybe they've built up a tolerance. By luck, they didn't get pills that were oversaturated with fentanyl. They got pills that had a better mixture, right? Because there's no chemists that are sitting there mixing this substance, right? So you never know what you're going to get. It's worse than Russian roulette. But the bottom line is the cartels are making billions right now. They continue to expand around the world. They're making billions from the migrant trafficking and other criminal activity, kidnapping, and all that stuff that they're doing. And guess what? If they lose 100,000 Americans, it's the cost of doing business. Just like when they lose a ton of cocaine or a ton of heroin or whatever it may be. Methamphetamine, they lost one shipment in 2021, never forget it because it was the mother load. They lost over 17,000 pounds of meth in a tractor trailer, 388 pounds of fentanyl. That's the cost of doing business. They just make more. They could care less about these young kids or the families. That's what people have not understood. Like, it's not like you and I thinking. Of course, you don't want to, they don't want to kill their customers. Let's just make that clear. In my opinion, the cartels are not sitting there saying, today we're going to kill 10,000 customers. They're not thinking about it. They don't care about it. They're focused on maximizing profits. What I do believe, though,
Yeah,
this is a personal opinion. I do believe as they get more experienced with synthetic drug manufacturing and also the way they mix drugs, they're going to be more conscientious about losing their customers. But here's the problem. Here's the problem. What a lot of people don't realize is not all the pills are being made in Mexico. There's local retail drug organizations all over America that are buying powder that's coming from Mexico, which could be fentanyl, it could be advertised as heroin, whatever. They're taking that into their houses. They're buying their own pill presses. They're making their own pills, but they don't know what they're mixing into the pills. So there's a lot of people dying from, domestically manufactured pills as well, too. It's not just coming from Mexico that's killing the kids, but it's the powder that's coming from Mexico. Mm-hmm. And by the way, in many cases, there's direct purchases still made from China where people are then making pills in their houses totally unrelated to the cartels. So that's another thing. It could be coming from Canada.
And this mixing of the xylazine, the trank,
yeah,
that's to enhance the high, or
right. They say it intensifies the high, but you got to remember, xylazine is not an opioid, so it doesn't respond to Narcan. Mm-hmm. It's a horse tranquilizer. It's a sedative for large animals, right? It's not made to put into your body. So that's why it's having these horrendous reactions of skin ulcerations, amputations. But xylazine, according to the information I received from law enforcement on the streets of America, some of these really addicted people feel it gives them a much more intense and long-lasting high. But it's a central nervous system depressant. So it's an absolute nightmare being mixed with fentanyl, and it's all over the place. DEA recently put out a warning they were seeing xylazine mixed with fentanyl in 48 out of the 50 states. By now, I'm sure it's every state.
Right. I want to hear about your experience at DEA. You were director of the Special Operations Unit division. What were you seeing? Do you have a high level of confidence in that department, or are there concerns about the future in terms of how that group works?
So that's a really, really good question. So I have a lot of concerns, okay? And probably my biggest concern is the emergence of these synthetic drugs and the lack of education in America at all levels of leadership and even down to the 12-year-old kids, okay? So I watched, and I told you before, I witnessed the just explosion of the synthetic drugs coming out of the labs in China. And then I watched the transition with the synthetic drugs going into Mexico. And now it's like the perfect storm because the Mexicans are bombarding our country with mass amounts of these drugs, and the public has no idea, for the most part, what's going on. Because our White House, the Department of Education, all these agencies are completely disregarding the threat for whatever reason, okay? Probably politics, because everything is political. But I also, before I left government, I put together what I referred to as the, you know, the emerging threats and I just can't remember. Just give me a second. Basically, it was the chart I talked to you about, how the complexity of threats are going through the roof. And then we saw the ability to deal with these threats are going down. So the gap between the good and evil is just continuing to grow. And now that's worse than ever. The explosion, and I can give you a copy of that if you want it, because I made it. I made this stuff, and I still pass it around. But basically, it's a very simple visual to understand the complexity of what we're dealing with. Now, when I was at SOD, we did many synchronized multi-agency operations to go after the cartels. We seized multi-millions of dollars. We seized mass amounts of drugs. We indicted some of the biggest traffickers in the world. We extradited a lot of these guys, but the problem is getting worse, right? And I feel bad saying that, but it's not for a lack of trying. It's not for a lack of effort, because law enforcement works very hard. They're still working very hard, but they need help. Law enforcement can't do this alone. If no one's educating the kids about the dangers of these synthetic drugs, then more and more kids are going to use these drugs, which is creating this massive demand, which creates the massive supply. If the government's not going to secure the southern border, it gives the cartels the opportunity to send a tsunami of deadly drugs to America. How's law enforcement going to stop that? They're already seizing record levels of pills, record levels of powdered fentanyl, record levels of methamphetamine. So it's not law enforcement problem alone to solve this. It's our country. It's our government. And right now, they're totally neglecting the encrypted technology. They're neglecting the fact that the Chinese are operating all over America, picking up cartel millions of dollars cash from the cartels and turning it over to Chinese businessmen who are buying property and land and farms in our country, real estate. From the cash they're picking up from cartels. And they're using encrypted banking apps. They're using WeChat, Chinese banking app, Chinese communication app. They're using all these other encrypted apps. Law enforcement is in the dark. I was on Department of Justice Going Dark Committee 20 years ago. I watched this emerge every year, getting harder and harder. Law enforcement has a huge mountain to climb just with technology. And so it's an absolute disaster. I don't like to be negative about it, but we have to work much smarter, because the bad guys are using the technology and they're blowing our doors off right now.
Yeah.
And we need much more cohesion. And unfortunately, 20 years after 9/11, we still have information sharing breakdowns, primarily because we lack leadership at the top. If you have the right leaders at the top, they push it down and they enforce information sharing, unity of effort. The only chance we have is if we put together a 100% unity of effort on the biggest threats to the country and do it now. Unfortunately, I wish I could feel optimistic that that's going to happen. We're not even calling out the threats publicly.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm interested to learn more about this growing gap between good and evil, like the technical sophistication of the cartels. It's very high.
That's just one aspect of it. The bureaucracy is another aspect of it. As we're getting hit around the world from these cyber criminals, the government is typical government reacting, putting more and more requirements on the government agencies to operate within a secure environment and all this stuff, which is important. Don't get me wrong, but it's causing resources to be shifted. It's causing like the limited expertise we already have in government to do like non-operational stuff as opposed to focusing on the enemy. There's so many enemies now, you don't know which one to pick. That's the scary part. And so it's just growing. It's more complex than it's ever been. And at the same time, we have congressional staffers and committees that are putting more and more restrictions on law enforcement because the ACLU is popping up and saying law enforcement's too aggressive. They're using like financial data from, let's just say, MoneyGram or Western Union or whatever the hell it is, okay? And they have these bulk collection programs. Well, what the hell are we supposed to do? We're trying to save American lives. That's what we're supposed to do. And the Congress doesn't do a lot to help. They talk a big game. They have a lot of hearings. They have a lot of meetings. They have a lot of people. They go on a lot of trips. But where the hell is the action? Where's the results?
Yeah.
So we're going through a very tough time. And I got news for you. Without national security, without a secure country, you have nothing. Doesn't matter how much money you have. Doesn't matter how many kids in your family. Doesn't matter how many grandkids. Doesn't matter what professional sports team you're on. Doesn't matter what movie you're in. Because if they hit us the way they're capable of hitting us, 20 years ago, they took down our towers. No one in America thought that was possible. They're shooting up schools all over the country because of mental illness everywhere. The media is covering that shit up too, by the way. So we got a lot of problems, and I don't like to be pessimistic, but this is my life every day. Things are changing quickly, but they're still thinking this is the old days. And by the way, even on the marijuana issue, the movement of legalizing marijuana. Where's all the thoughts and discussion about how the new marijuana that these kids are smoking today are not only causing schizophrenia, psychosis, and massive anxiety and depression, and those same kids then are turning to pills for help. Total disaster. And if any of those stories are true about studying the recent massive school shooters, that they were all like obsessive marijuana users, if any of that stuff is true, because you don't even know if you're getting, truth in the news these days. But the Wall Street Journal did have a story about that, and they're a credible organization. Mm-hmm. And so if that's true, which I think it is true, I think that the marijuana today that's being smoked is destroying the brains of a lot of these kids that are already depressed, already have anxiety.
Especially if it's in conjunction with other pills that they're taking or medications.
Exactly. And by the way, did you know, Christian, that the Chinese organized criminals that are buying real estate in America and buying houses in America are also making these indoor grow operations at record levels in the western part of America, and they're distributing very pure THC marijuana throughout America?
So that's another attack.
Another problem. Another problem that we're not even talking about in the news. So the real question is, why isn't the current administration talking about the growing threats of China in America? I know what my opinion is, and that's the laptop from hell, and it's what we call blackmail.
Yeah. I think
that's a lot of people That's another story for another day.
Yeah. I'd love to touch on that another time. Yeah, I mean, it's disheartening, and it's a perfect storm, not only of the external attacks from America's adversaries, the porous border, the law enforcement inundated with work and the restrictions that they're facing, but also the demand on the part of the American people. I mean, you're talking about these kids, these adults who are more anxious than ever, and they are turning to these chemicals, to these pills, and not even realizing the threats to themselves. I mean, my heart breaks for all the broken people who are resorting to this.
Right. Well, look, just this past week, the board, CBP in Arizona, in California, they seized a tractor trailer loaded with 3.5 million pills coming from Mexico in green beans. So the productions, what's that?
They were disguised in the produce.
Yeah, they were put in green beans. The production levels right now in Mexico are off the charts as the Mexican president gets on national news and says they're not producing fentanyl in Mexico. So he's lying to the world as well.
Yeah. So if there was some sort of military intervention to attack the cartels, what implications would that have for the Mexican government? Because I'm sure a lot of critics of this suggestion would say, well, we don't want another Afghanistan where we collapse the legitimate government, it falls apart, we lose interest, pull out, and then the Taliban come back, or maybe the cartels once again maintain a narco state after outlasting America. What do you think about this?
Well, again, I'm not an expert on these world diplomatic relationships and stuff like that. But what I would say is let's keep it simple. In the history of America, we have never lost this many American kids. Our future generation is dying like one every 5 or 6 minutes, whatever it is. So we have to do something different. We can't keep doing the same old thing and expect different results. We have to be way more aggressive. So there was a meeting recently in Washington with all the leadership from the Mexican government, with the leadership in the Department of Justice, talking about strategies to work with each other on all these complex problems. So I hope during those discussions, our U.S. leaders offered up any assistance like U.S. military assets if needed. Now, unfortunately, I doubt that happened, and I doubt the Mexicans would ever want that type of support because the current president in Mexico is very soft on crime and has his hugs for thugs, no bullets policies. So he's not going to want to go attacking the cartels. So none of that's going to happen anytime soon, unless somehow, some way, which I don't even know how it's possible, the U.S. did unilateral action in Mexico. I don't see that happening anytime soon. But the reality is, at some point in time, we can't sustain you losing over 100,000 Americans every year from deadly drugs coming out of Mexico without action in Mexico. We have hundreds of people lined up down there waiting extradition. We have labs popping up all over the place that they're not going after. They're not allowing our agents to work these bilateral cases like we used to work. So we'll see how they react. We'll see how they respond. Of course, it's not a popular, nobody wants to use the military for anything. But you have to defend your kids and your families, right? Somehow, some way. If Al-Qaeda or Hezbollah was developing biological and chemical weapons in Mexico, you think we'd be sitting back and waiting for it to happen? Well, what the hell you think fentanyl is? It's a chemical weapon used against our kids. So it's a difficult and complex topic. We have a lot of smart people in America. Hopefully they put the American kids first, because America can no longer rely on soft on crime and corrupt leaders in Mexico to save our kids.
One more question before we wrap up. What can individual Americans do to help fight this problem?
Well, for one, we already have an army of families around America that are doing rallies, putting up billboards, going into the schools. They can become more educated. So, for example, one thing I advise every family in America to sit down with their kids, their grandkids, their nephews, their nieces, and watch the documentary Dead on Arrival. I have no vested interest in that documentary, but it's 20 minutes long. It's the most powerful documentary that I watch because 4 of my friends that I work with closely are featured in that film talking about the loss of their loved one. So it's very sad, but it's very powerful. So the kids need to watch this. The families need to watch it. The DEA has a phenomenal website, resources, One Pill Can Kill, which could give families everything they need to know to be educating themselves about this new crisis. There's other nonprofits all over the country, like Song for Charlie in California, Lost Voices of Fentanyl operating out of Baltimore, Demand Zero up in Connecticut, and Families Against Fentanyl, Facing Fentanyl. I could go on all day because I support them all. They produce mass amounts of educational material since our government's not doing it. When's the last time you watched a public service announcement? I haven't seen it. And the sad part is, even if they do it on the mainstream media, the kids aren't going to be watching it.
Yeah.
It's got to be on that's why I want a White House summit. So we have to just get more educated. We have to talk to the kids. We have to be more engaged. We can't be in denial as parents, as grandparents, as uncles and aunts. You have to understand that this can impact anybody's kid, because kids in this world today, instead of just learning from mistakes, unfortunately, they're dying from mistakes. When I was a kid, I made plenty of mistakes, but thank God I didn't die from a mistake. Now you take one pill, you die, you don't get a second chance. So Americans can be way more engaged. Corporate America could be way more responsible, way more engaged. Educate their workforce. Stop being in denial. Stop this legalization of drug movement until you understand what's going on, because it's clouding the messages. It's like, this is not, like I say all the time, this is not grandpa's opioid crisis. Even though my heart goes out for all these addicted people that are out there and their families, because it's a struggle every day. And we do have an addiction crisis, but that's overlapping with this poisoning crisis now.
Mm-hmm.
But the poisoning crisis requires a whole different approach, because people are dying instantly. Thank God for Narcan. Take advantage of the over-the-counter Narcan, but that's not going to solve this problem. So we need also families in America to hold their local, state, and federal representatives responsible and accountable for action. Yeah. Right now, there's no accountability. The rule of law is gone in America too, by the way. Add that to your list before that I talked about. You talk about the complexity and the ability to deal with it. Where the hell's the rule of law? Look at these people in the country that are breaking down, the doors of businesses and putting businesses on fire, destroying these small businesses, and they get out of jail the next day.
Yeah.
Like, and then we got politicians doing all this dirty, corrupt stuff. Nothing happens. It's like insane. It's hard to imagine this is America, that this is happening in.
Yeah. Going back to some of those nonprofits you mentioned that are working on the fentanyl crisis, is anybody tracking like which members of Congress are taking action on this? Because when you talked about your appearance in front of that committee and a Tennessee member started attacking the DEA for something completely unrelated.
Cohen is his name, Steve Cohen. He wasn't directly attacking DEA. He was basically saying that you guys, I know you do all this great work, like you're targeting Pablo Escobar, like just very ignorant on what the issues are, okay? So, but there are families that do track. Some do it better than others. Some nonprofits are way more engaged than others, but they have a lot of visits to Washington now. They're visiting committees. There's certainly a movement in some of the committees to, bring more attention and more exposure to this stuff. But it's just not good enough.
Yeah.
There's a lot of wheels spinning. There's actually a movement now where there's over 18, I think at least 18 state attorney generals that have wanted to designate fentanyl a weapon of mass destruction. Mm-hmm. There's certain congressmen and women that are pushing bills and other, stuff in Congress to designate fentanyl a weapon of mass destruction. It seems like there's a lot more people trying, but there's a lot of wheels spinning as well.
Yeah. Well, it's a disturbing picture. I'm glad you're out there spreading the word on this.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's very sad because, when you deal with these families and you start getting a taste of reality, and so I'm just trying to help them. I mean, they call me like the voice of the voiceless, because for a while they had nobody listening to them. So I stirred up a lot of people, a lot of media outlets, a lot of podcasters, a lot of congressional staffers and members, and got more attention put on the problem. Because right now, you have law enforcement doing a good job, but you don't have these other components in the government being held accountable.
Yeah. Well, how can people find you in your work?
Well, unfortunately, I have a YouTube channel, but I feel that it's being censored a lot. But I put all my media appearances on there. I have a Twitter handle, Derek Maltz _Sr. Yep. I post a lot of stuff on Twitter. I have an Instagram account, which I don't use as much, but I've been starting to use more. I have Truth Social. I have Getter. So I push out as much as I can. I have a Facebook, National Security and Public Safety page where I post as much as I can. I will use any type of social media, pushing out as much as I can, but unfortunately I don't have millions of followers. But I do the best I can with that. So, and I'm on like news on a regular basis. I do podcasts, I do radio shows,
Yep.
trying to get the word out. But again, like I said, we've been doing this several years. We've made documentaries and it's getting worse. So we need help. We need more engagement. We need more action. We need to be way more aggressive and less deceptive.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I hope people listen to this and I hope they start taking action, beginning with a talk with their children or grandchildren, and also maybe supporting you and some of these organizations you mentioned.
I appreciate it. Anything you need, I'm here to help. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about this topic. I get a little passionate about it because I'm sick of talking about it.
Yeah.
I want action, and I really can't take much more of it because I'd rather see results. I'm about results, not talk.
Yep. Well, Derek, thank you so much today. Thank you so much for sharing this information. And for those of you watching at home, if you found this useful, give it a like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more. Thank you, guys.